You never know how strong you are until being strong is the only choice you have. I learned this the hard way when I woke up in a hospital bed after 6 weeks in a coma, only to discover that my mother-in-law had sold my house, the home I'd poured my heart and savings into for 3 years. But let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about finding strength in the darkest moments of your life. My name is Rachel, and until last spring, I was living what I thought was a perfect life in Boston. As a pediatric nurse at Boston Children's Hospital, I spent my days helping young patients fight their battles while coming home to a beautiful Victorian townhouse on Beacon Street that I shared with my husband, Daniel. We'd been married for 4 years, and I truly believed we were living the dream. The house was my pride and joy. We'd spent 3 years renovating it, turning it from a tired old townhouse into a warm, welcoming home. Every weekend was spent picking out paint colors, refinishing hardwood floors, and planning our future in this space. That morning started like any other. I kissed Daniel goodbye as he left for his financial advisory firm, and I headed to my shift at the hospital. The last thing I remember was driving through an intersection on my way to work. They told me later that a truck ran a red light. 6 weeks of my life disappeared in that moment. I wish I could say the accident was the worst part of this story. But life has a way of testing you beyond what you think you can handle. When I finally opened my eyes, I was alone in the hospital room. No Daniel, no flowers. Just the steady beep of monitors and the harsh fluorescent lights above. Dr. Sarah Martinez, my colleague and friend, was the first person I saw. The look on her face told me something was terribly wrong, even before she spoke. "Rachel, there's something you need to know," she said, holding my hand. "Your mother-in-law, Patricia. She sold your house while you were in the coma. She claimed it was legally hers all along. I thought it was the medication making me hallucinate. Our house? The one Daniel and I bought together? The one where every room held memories of our life together? It couldn't be possible." But as Dr. Martinez continued speaking, the horrible reality began to sink in. Patricia Thompson, my mother-in-law, had somehow produced documentation showing she was the legal owner of our home. While I lay unconscious, fighting for my life, she had sold it to a young couple who had already moved in. But where was Daniel? Where was my husband in all of this? Dr. Martinez's next words shattered what was left of my world. "Daniel supported his mother's claim," she said softly. "He's been living in their family estate in Brookline since the sale. The pain from my injuries was nothing compared to the agony of this betrayal. Through my tears, I learned the full extent of their deception. Patricia, a real estate agent, had apparently helped us with the original purchase of the house. What I didn't know was that she had manipulated the paperwork, putting her name on crucial documents while I trusted her to handle the closing process. For 3 years, she had waited, watching as I poured my savings into renovations, knowing along that she could pull the rug out from under me at any moment. I spent the next few days in a fog of disbelief and heartbreak. The nurses whispered in the hallways. Everyone knew my story. I was the woman whose mother-in-law stole her house while she was in a coma. The woman whose husband chose his mother's, sighed over his unconscious wife. The humiliation was almost as bad as the betrayal. But sometimes, when life pushes you to the edge, you find out who your real friends are. Jessica Chen, my best friend and the hospital's administrator, was by my side the moment she heard I was awake. She didn't come with empty words of comfort. Instead, she came with a plan. "You're coming to live with me," she said, her determination leaving no room for argument. "And I've already contacted the best real estate lawyer in Boston. Patricia Thompson might think she's clever, but she's never gone up against someone like Caroline Walsh." It was in Jessica's modern Cambridge condo, overlooking the Charles River, that I began to piece my life back together. The medical bills were staggering, but my colleagues at the hospital had rallied around me, organizing fundraisers and donating their vacation days to cover my leave. Their support showed me that while one family had betrayed me, another had formed around me. Stronger than blood ties, the legal battle was brutal. Patricia had indeed manipulated the paperwork skillfully, taking advantage of my trust and Daniel's compliance. But she had made one crucial mistake. In her haste to sell the house while I was unconscious, she had failed to follow proper procedures for a property sale when one resident was medically incapacitated. It was a small detail, but in the hands of Caroline Walsh, it became a weapon. The first time I faced Patricia and Daniel in court, I almost broke down. Patricia sat there, perfectly coiffed in her designer suit, looking at me with the same condescending smile she'd worn since the day I married her son. Daniel couldn't even meet my eyes. But something strange happened as I took the stand. Looking at them, I didn't see the powerful, intimidating figures they'd once been. I saw two people so morally bankrupt that they would steal from someone, fighting for their life in a hospital bed. That realization gave me strength I didn't know I had. My voice didn't shake as I testified about the renovations I'd paid for, the memories we'd built, the future that had been stolen from me. The judge's face grew sterner with each detail. But the real turning point came from an unexpected source. Thomas, Patricia's former assistant at her real estate agency, came forward with emails proving she had planned this deception from the beginning. He'd kept copies of everything, disgusted by what he'd witnessed but too afraid to speak up until now. The case made headlines in Boston. Real estate agent faces fraud charges in house theft from coma patient. Patricia's reputation in the real estate community, something she'd prized above all else, was shattered. The investigation into her practices revealed a pattern of similar manipulations, though none quite as bold as what she'd done to me. The court's decision was clear. The house sale was invalidated, and Patricia was facing criminal charges for fraud. But by then, I'd realized something important. I didn't want that house anymore. Every inch of it was tainted with betrayal. Instead, I wanted justice, and I wanted to make sure this couldn't happen to anyone else. The settlement I received was substantial. Patricia's insurance company was eager to settle the matter quietly, especially given the publicity. Daniel, showing a spark of conscience or perhaps just fear of public opinion, didn't contest it. But money couldn't heal the deeper wounds, the trust issues, the nightmares, the fear of being vulnerable again. That's when Dr. Martinez made a suggestion that would change my life's direction. "Rachel," she said during one of our many coffee chats, "have you thought about what you want to do with the settlement? Because I have an idea." She told me about the growing need for patient advocacy, especially for people dealing with medical crises who become vulnerable to financial and legal exploitation. Too many people lost their homes, their savings, their security while fighting for their lives in hospital beds. My story, it seemed, was not as unique as I'd thought. That conversation sparked something in me. Within months, I'd founded the Yaina New Beginning Advocacy Center, operating out of a converted brownstone in Boston's South End. We provide legal support, financial counseling, and housing assistance to patients and families facing medical crises. Every person who walks through our doors has a story of vulnerability, and every one of them finds the support I wish I'd had. The irony isn't lost on me that Patricia's attempt to destroy my life ended up giving it new purpose. Our center has helped prevent dozens of predatory property sales and financial scams targeting hospitalized patients. We've changed laws, making it harder for anyone to take advantage of medically incapacitated individuals. Last week, I ran into Daniel at a coffee shop. He looked older, tired, worn down by the scandal and his mother's disgrace. He tried to apologize, to explain, but I stopped him. "Save it," I said. "Just know that every day, I help people protect themselves from people like you and your mother. That's all the closure I need." I walked away from that encounter feeling lighter than I had in months. Standing in the crisp Boston air, watching the autumn leaves dance along Beacon Street, I realized something profound. Sometimes life's worst betrayals lead us exactly where we need to be. If you're watching this and facing your own battle, remember, you're stronger than you know. Don't let anyone steal your power, your purpose, or your peace. The darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures, but only if you're brave enough to keep fighting. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and join our community of survivors and thrivers. Remember to ring that notification bell to never miss another story of triumph over adversity. Your support helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages of hope and resilience. And remember, sometimes losing everything is just the beginning of finding yourself. Getting up each morning became a test of willpower in Jessica's guest room. The unfamiliarity of waking up in a different space hit me harder than the physical pain from my accident.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
My hands would instinctively reach for the bedside lamp that wasn't there anymore, and my feet would search for the plush carpet I'd picked out for our bedroom, now someone else's bedroom. The modern minimalism of Jessica's condo, while beautiful, felt like a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. My first week out of the hospital was a blur of doctor's appointments and legal consultations. Caroline Walsh, my attorney, had taken over the dining room table with stacks of documents, each one revealing more layers to Patricia's deception. The property records showed a careful, calculated plan that had been years in the making. Every time I looked at the papers, I felt physically ill. My signature appeared on documents I had no memory of signing, dates were altered, and entire pages seemed to have been substituted. Jessica would find me some mornings, still in my pajamas, staring out her floor-to-ceiling windows at the Charles River. The early morning rowers would glide past, their rhythmic movements a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. "You need to get out," she said one morning, placing a cup of coffee in my hands. "Just for a little while. The fresh air will do you good." I knew she was right, but the thought of facing the world terrified me. What if I ran into Daniel, or, worse, Patricia? Boston suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. Every street held memories I wasn't ready to confront. The coffee shop where Daniel and I had our first date. The hardware store where we'd spent countless weekends picking out paint samples. The park where he'd proposed. My life had become a minefield of memories I needed to navigate. But Jessica was persistent. She started small. A walk to the corner cafe, then to the local farmer's market. Each step outside felt like a small victory. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Life was continuing around me, oblivious to my personal earthquake. It was during one of these walks that I saw them. Daniel and Patricia coming out of an upscale restaurant on Newbury Street. They hadn't noticed me, but I froze mid-step, my heart pounding. Patricia was laughing, probably at one of her own jokes, while Daniel smiled that weak smile I now realized had been a warning sign all along. They looked normal, as if they hadn't just destroyed someone's life, as if they hadn't left me with nothing while I fought for my life in a hospital bed. Jessica grabbed my arm, ready to steer me away, but something in me snapped. The fog, a victimhood that had surrounded me these past weeks, suddenly lifted. Why was I the one hiding? Why was I the one ashamed? I straightened my spine and walked right past them, head held high. Patricia's laugh cut off abruptly when she saw me. Daniel's face drained of color. "Rachel," he started, taking a step toward me. But I kept walking, my heels clicking purposefully on the pavement. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. The crushing weight of betrayal was still there, but it was joined by something else: anger. Not the destructive kind that burns everything in its path, but the kind that forges steel. Back at Jessica's condo, I finally opened the box of personal items the hospital had saved from my accident. My clothes, my phone with its cracked screen, my work ID badge. At the bottom was my nursing certification, slightly bent but intact. Looking at it, I remembered why I'd become a nurse in the first place, to help people at their most vulnerable moments. "I need to go back to work," I announced to Jessica that evening. She looked up from her laptop, surprised. "Are you sure? You still have weeks of medical leave left." I nodded, feeling more certain than I had in weeks. "I need this. I need to feel useful again." Dr. Martinez welcomed me back to the pediatric ward with a warm hug and understanding eyes. The children's faces lit up when they saw me. They hadn't forgotten. Little Emma, fighting leukemia with the ferocity of a warrior, had made me a welcome back card covered in glitter. 7-year-old Marcus, recovering from heart surgery, saved me half of his Jell-O cup. Being back at work gave my days purpose again, but the nights were still hard. In the quiet hours when Jessica was asleep and the city outside had settled into its nighttime rhythm, the questions would come. How had I been so blind? Why hadn't I seen the signs? The way Patricia had insisted on handling all the paperwork during the house purchase. How she'd always made comments about my name not being on certain documents, playing it off as a clerical error that she'd take care of later. Caroline called with updates almost daily. The investigation into Patricia's real estate dealings had opened a Pandora's box. Other victims were coming forward, first-time homebuyers who'd lost their deposits, elderly clients whose properties had been undervalued and quickly resold for profit. Patricia's perfect facade was cracking, revealing the predator beneath. One evening, as I was leaving the hospital, I ran into Thomas, Patricia's former assistant, in the parking lot. He was visiting his sister, a nurse in the cardiac unit. The guilt was written all over his face when he saw me. "I should have said something sooner," he blurted out. "I knew what she was doing to you was wrong, but I was scared. She had dirt on everyone, kept files on anyone who could threaten her." We ended up talking for hours at a nearby diner, the kind of place Patricia wouldn't be caught dead in. Thomas painted a picture of a woman so consumed by control and appearance that she'd do anything to maintain them. She'd seen me as a threat from the beginning, a middle-class nurse who'd stolen her precious son from the society marriage she'd planned for him. She started planning this the day Daniel proposed to you, Thomas revealed, pushing his coffee cup away. She knew exactly what she was doing when she offered to help with the house purchase. She kept the real documents in a safe in her office, switched them out when needed. Daniel. He knew some of it, but I don't think he knew everything. He was always too afraid to stand up to her. The revelation should have hurt, but instead it filled me with a strange sense of peace. It hadn't been my fault. There was nothing I could have done differently. Patricia's manipulation had been too perfect, too calculated. But now her house of cards was falling, and I was still standing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in Jessica's living room, watching the city lights reflect off the river. The anger that had been building inside me was transforming into something else. Determination. Patricia had taken my house, my marriage, my sense of security. But she hadn't taken my strength, my skills, or my ability to rebuild. I opened my laptop and started researching patient advocacy organizations, medical legal partnerships, support groups for victims of fraud. The more I read, the more I realized how many people faced similar situations, vulnerable patients whose lives were upended while they were fighting for their health. The system that was supposed to protect them was full of loopholes that people like Patricia knew how to exploit. Jessica found me still awake at dawn, surrounded by notes and printouts. "I think I know what I want to do," I told her, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep but filled with conviction. "I want to help other people protect themselves from what happened to me. There need to be better safeguards, better support systems." She looked at my notes, her administrative mind already seeing the possibilities. "You know," she said slowly, The hospital has been talking about starting a patient advocacy program. They just haven't found the right person to lead it. The idea took root and grew. Dr. Martinez connected me with the hospital's board members. My story, unfortunately, made a compelling case for why such a program was needed. The same determination that had helped me survive nursing school now drove me to research, plan, and build something new from the ashes of my old life. Caroline called with news that the criminal investigation into Patricia was progressing. They'd found evidence of multiple fraudulent property deals spanning years. The scandal was growing, and Patricia's carefully cultivated social status was evaporating. She'd been asked to resign from her positions on various charity boards. Her real estate license was suspended pending investigation. I ran into Daniel's sister, Emily, at Whole Foods one afternoon. Unlike her mother and brother, she looked me in the eye. "I'm so sorry, Rachel," she said, her voice breaking. "I never thought Mom would go this far. Daniel, he's not doing well. The guilt is eating him alive." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "He should feel guilty," I finally managed. "He had a choice. He chose wrong." Back at the hospital, I threw myself into developing the advocacy program. Every patient I saw reminded me why this work was so important. The young mother fighting cancer while trying to keep her house. The elderly man whose children were pressuring him to sign over his property. The accident victim whose insurance company was trying to deny coverage on a technicality. Jessica's guest room slowly became home. I bought new bedding, hung a few pictures, added small touches that made the space feel mine. One evening, as we shared takeout and wine on her balcony, she asked if I'd thought about looking for my own place. "Not yet," I admitted. "I'm not ready to trust in ownership again." The irony wasn't lost on me that my work was helping others protect their homes, while I couldn't face the idea of having one myself. But maybe that was okay for now. Maybe part of healing was accepting that some things take time. Fall turned to winter, and Boston wrapped itself in snow. The city looked different under its white blanket, softer, cleaner, full of possibility. I started taking evening walks along the river, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this city in the first place. During one of these walks, I got a call from Caroline. Patricia had been indicted on multiple counts of fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, including emails and documents Thomas had provided. She was facing serious prison time. Daniel had been named as a co-conspirator but was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence. I sat on a snow-covered bench, letting the news sink in. Justice was coming, but it felt hollow somehow. I realized I didn't need to see Patricia in handcuffs or Daniel in court to heal. My recovery wasn't tied to their punishment anymore. It was tied to what I was building, to the people I was helping, to the woman I was becoming. That evening, I finally opened the last box of belongings Jessica had rescued from our house before the new owners moved in. Inside was a photo album I'd forgotten about. Pictures of Daniel and me in happier times, of the house when we first bought it, of family gatherings where Patricia's smile now looked predatory rather than welcoming. I closed the album and put it aside. Those memories belonged to a different person. The Rachel who trusted too easily, who ignored red flags, who thought love meant accepting whatever scraps of affection were thrown her way. The woman I was becoming knew better. Jessica found me later, still sorting through the box. Without a word, she sat down beside me and started helping. We made two piles, things to keep and things to let go. The kept pile was small, but it was mine, truly mine. No hidden strings, no manipulated documents, no false claims of ownership. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in months. In my dreams, I wasn't running from Patricia or searching for Daniel. I was standing in front of a room full of people, sharing my story, teaching them how to protect themselves and their loved ones. When I woke up, I knew it wasn't just a dream. It was a glimpse of my future. The first snowfall of winter blanketed Boston in white silence as I sat in Caroline Walsh's downtown office, reviewing the latest developments in the case. The mountain of evidence against Patricia had grown into an avalanche. Thomas hadn't just kept emails. He'd maintained a detailed record of every questionable transaction, every manipulated document, every conversation where Patricia had revealed her true nature. "There's something else you should know," Caroline said, sliding a manila envelope across her mahogany desk. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Pictures of me leaving the hospital for physical therapy, getting coffee with Jessica, walking along the Charles River. "Patricia had you followed," Caroline explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. "She was building a case to claim you were physically fine and trying to scam her." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Even now, months after everything, Patricia was still trying to destroy me. But as I flipped through the photographs, something unexpected happened. Instead of fear or anger, I felt pity. What kind? Of person spent their time and money stalking an injured woman? What emptiness inside Patricia drove her to such lengths? That evening, I had dinner with Dr. Martinez at her favorite Italian restaurant in the North End. The small family-owned place was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of garlic and herbs. Over plates of handmade pasta, I shared the latest development. Sarah listened intently, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "You know what this means, don't you?" she asked, reaching for her wine glass. "She's scared, really scared. These photos aren't about building a case against you. They're about trying to find something, anything, to discredit you before her trial." The thought had never occurred. To me, I'd been so focused on seeing myself as the victim that I hadn't realized how the tables had turned. Patricia's reputation was in shambles. Her social circle had abandoned her. The charity boards that once competed for her attention now pretended they'd never heard of her. Even her country club membership had been quietly revoked. The next morning, I threw myself into work with renewed energy. The patient advocacy program was taking shape, growing beyond my initial vision. What had started as a simple support system for vulnerable patients had evolved into a comprehensive program that included legal advice, financial counseling, and housing assistance. Emma, my young leukemia patient, had become my unofficial cheerleader. Despite her own battles, she always asked about my progress, offering suggestions with the unfiltered wisdom only a child could provide. "You should have a superhero cape," she declared one day during her treatment. "Like a real superhero, but instead of fighting bad guys with powers, you fight bad guys with papers." Her words stayed with me, making me smile at unexpected moments. In a way, she was right. This wasn't just about my story anymore. It was about fighting a different kind of villain, the kind that prey on people when they're most vulnerable. Jessica's condo had become more than just a temporary shelter. The spare room now felt like mine, decorated with small touches that reflected my new life. A potted peace lily from my hospital colleagues, a framed print of the Charles River at sunset, a corkboard filled with thank you notes from patients and their families. Each item represented a step forward, away from the woman who had lost everything toward someone new and stronger. One crisp morning, as I walked to work, I passed by my old house. I hadn't meant to. My feet had carried me there automatically, following a path they'd walked hundreds of times before. The new owners had painted the door a cheerful yellow, and window boxes full of winter pansies brightened the facade. For the first time, I looked at it without pain. It wasn't my house anymore, and that was okay. The criminal proceedings against Patricia were moving forward rapidly. Caroline called with updates almost daily, each one more satisfying than the last. The prosecution had uncovered a pattern of fraud spanning more than a decade. Patricia hadn't just targeted me, she'd built her entire career on manipulation and deceit. Daniel, true to form, had crumbled under pressure. He'd accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against his mother in exchange for probation. Part of me wanted to hate him for taking the easy way out again, but mostly, I felt nothing. The man I'd married, the man I'd thought I knew, had never really existed. The hospital board approved the expansion of our advocacy program. We were getting our own space, a renovated wing dedicated to supporting patients and families facing non-medical challenges during their medical crises. Dr. Martinez had championed the project, using my story as a powerful example of why such support was essential. As I walked through the empty rooms that would soon become offices, counseling spaces, and meeting areas, I felt a sense of purpose I'd never known before. The walls were bare, waiting for paint and life, but I could already see what this place would become. A sanctuary, a fortress, a place where people like me could find the support they needed to fight back. Jessica found me there after her shift, standing in what would be my office. The winter sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting long shadows on the floor. "You look like you belong here," she said, smiling. She was right. For the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, I felt completely at home. The news of Patricia's arrest broke on a Tuesday morning. I was in a meeting with the hospital's legal team when my phone started buzzing with messages. The Boston Globe had run a front-page story. Prominent realtor arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The photograph showed Patricia being led from her home in handcuffs, her perfectly coiffed hair disheveled, her designer outfit replaced by a hastily thrown-on tracksuit. I excused myself from the meeting and found a quiet corner in the hospital garden. The winter air was sharp in my lungs as I read the article. The details were all there: the fraudulent property deals, the manipulated documents, the stolen homes. My case was mentioned, described as the catalyst that had brought her crimes to light. Emily called that afternoon. She was crying, but not for her mother. "I found Dad's old files," she said between sobs. "Mom did the same thing to him before. He died. The summer house he left me in his will. She sold it and kept the money. She told me he'd gambled it away. I believed her. I blamed him for years." We met for coffee the next day. Emily had changed since I'd last seen her. The polished society woman was gone, replaced by someone more real, more vulnerable. We talked for hours, sharing stories, connecting dots, healing old wounds. She'd brought a box of old photographs, including some of her father. Looking at his kind face, I could see why Patricia had targeted him, just as she'd targeted me. Kind people, trusting people, were her preferred prey. The advocacy center was coming together quickly. We'd hired staff, developed programs, created resources. Each day brought new challenges, but also new victories. A grandmother keeping her home despite her grandson's attempts to claim power of attorney. A cancer patient successfully fighting. An insurance denial. A stroke survivor protecting his assets from predatory lenders. One evening, as I was leaving work, I found Thomas waiting by my car. He looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot in the cold. "I'm testifying against Patricia. Tomorrow," he said without preamble. "I wanted you to know. I'm telling everything. Every deal, every document, every conversation." She tried to buy my silence, but I'm done being afraid of her. I reached out and squeezed his hand, feeling the tremors running through him. "Thank you," I said simply. He nodded, blinking back tears, and hurried away into the gathering darkness. His testimony would be the final nail in Patricia's coffin, and we both knew it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood at Jessica's window, watching the snow fall over the city. So much had changed in such a short time. The woman who had woken, up in that hospital bed, broken and betrayed, felt like a stranger now. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned that losing everything sometimes means finding yourself. The next morning, I did something I'd been putting off for months. I went to the bank and opened a new account, one with only my name on it. The settlement money from Patricia's insurance company had been sitting in a temporary account, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. Now I knew. Half would go to the advocacy center, funding programs for patients who couldn't afford legal help. The other half would be my fresh start. Jessica found me that evening, sorting through real estate listings on my laptop. "Ready to find your own place?" she asked, settling beside me with 2 cups of tea. I nodded, feeling both nervous and excited. "I think it's time. But this time I'm handling every document myself." We looked at properties together, laughing at some of the more outrageous listings and seriously considering others. A small brownstone in the south end caught my eye, not too far from the hospital, with good bones and a tiny garden. It needed work, but this time, any improvements I made would be purely for me. The trial began the following week. I attended only one day, the day I testified. Patricia sat at the defense table, her designer outfit replaced by something deliberately modest, her makeup subtle, playing the role of the misunderstood grandmother. Our eyes met as I took the stand. She tried to stare me down, but I didn't flinch. I told my story clearly, calmly, without emotion. I wasn't there for revenge. I was there for justice, not just for me, but for every person she had ever victimized. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. I declined to comment, but as I walked to my car, I heard one of them say, "That's the nurse who brought down Boston's biggest real estate fraud scheme." The description made me smile. Not victim, not patient, not ex-wife. Nurse, professional, whistleblower. The Advocacy Center opened officially on a bright spring morning. The renovated space was everything I'd imagined and more. Warm colors, comfortable furniture, an atmosphere of safety and support. Dr. Martinez cut the ribbon while local news cameras rolled. Emma, now in remission, stood beside me, proudly wearing a toy stethoscope and a cape she'd made herself, royal blue with the words "Paper Fighter" written in glitter. As I looked around at the gathered crowd, colleagues, patients, supporters, I felt a profound sense of rightness. Patricia had tried to destroy me, but instead, she'd set me free. Free from a marriage that had been built on lies. Free from the illusion of security that had kept me from growing. Free to become someone stronger, braver, more authentic. Later, that day, I received word that the jury had reached a verdict. Patricia was found guilty on all counts. She would spend the next 15 years in federal prison. Daniel received probation and community service. The news felt anticlimactic somehow. I was already living my happily ever after. That evening, I signed the papers on my new home. The brownstone in the south end, with its crooked stairs and weathered facade, represented more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of my rebirth, my resilience, my determination to build something real and lasting on my own terms. As I stood in the empty living room, keys in hand, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The betrayal that had seemed like an ending had really been a beginning. The loss that had felt like destruction had been a foundation. Sometimes, life's greatest gifts come disguised as its cruelest blows. I opened the windows, letting in the spring breeze. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing, and the sound of children playing floated up from the street below. I was home. Not in a house that someone else could steal, but in a life I had built for myself, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. The sun was setting, painting the walls with streaks of gold. Tomorrow, I would start making this space my own. But for now, I simply stood there, breathing in the possibility of new beginnings and the sweet certainty of knowing exactly who I was and what I was capable of surviving. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the newly installed stained glass window in my brownstone, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the hardwood floors. 6 months had passed since I'd bought this place, and slowly but surely, it was becoming a reflection of who I truly was. Each renovation decision, every paint color, Each piece of furniture had been chosen with deliberate care. No one else's input needed or wanted. My morning routine had evolved into something sacred. Coffee on the small balcony overlooking the South End's historic streets, watching the neighborhood come alive. The local baker 2 doors down pulling fresh bread from his ovens, the school children in their uniforms hurrying past with backpacks bouncing, the elderly couple who walked their golden retriever at precisely 7:15 every morning, all had become familiar characters in my new life story. The advocacy center was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. What had started as a response to personal tragedy had grown into something that touched hundreds of lives. This morning, we were expecting our 100th client, a milestone that felt surreal. Each person who walked through our doors carried their own story of vulnerability, their own fears, their own need for protection. My phone buzzed with a message from Emily. Since the trial, our unexpected friendship had deepened into something neither of us could have predicted. She'd found her voice, stepping out of Patricia's shadow to become an advocate for financial literacy education. Her text contained a link to her latest blog post, How to Protect Your Assets When Family Becomes Toxic. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The morning's first appointment arrived precisely at 9, a young woman named Maya, clutching a folder of medical bills and legal notices. Her hands trembled as she sat across from me, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for escape routes. I recognized that look. I'd worn it myself not so long ago. "My father-in-law," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's trying to force us to sell our house while my husband is deployed overseas. He claims he helped with the down payment, that he has rights to the property. But the money was my husband's inheritance from his mother. I have all the documentation, but he's so confident, so intimidating. He keeps saying no one will believe me." As I listened to Maya's story, I felt a familiar fire ignite in my chest. The details were different, but the pattern was the same. Someone with power trying to exploit a moment of vulnerability. I reached for my phone and sent a quick text to Caroline. Within minutes, she'd cleared her morning schedule. While we waited for Caroline to arrive, I shared some of my own story with Maya. Not to overshadow her experience, but to show her she wasn't alone, that survival was possible, that fighting back wasn't just an option, but a necessity. The tension in her shoulders began to ease as she realized she'd found allies in her battle. Caroline swept in like a force of nature, her trademark red blazer bright against the office's calm blue walls. She listened to Maya's situation, asked pointed questions, and began outlining a strategy. I watched Maya's expression shift from despair to hope as Caroline explained how we could protect her home and her rights. After Maya left, armed with a plan and our full support, Caroline lingered in my office. "You know," she said, settling into one of the visitor chairs, "we're seeing a pattern here. These cases keep coming, and they all have common elements. Family members exploiting medical situations, deployed service members, elderly parents. There's a gap in the law that needs addressing." She was right, of course. Each case that came through our doors highlighted systemic failures that needed fixing. The laws designed to protect vulnerable people were full of loopholes that the Patricia Thompsons of the world knew how to exploit. That afternoon, I had a meeting scheduled with state legislators who had taken an interest in our work. The Advocacy Center's success stories had caught their attention, and they wanted to discuss potential legal reforms. As I prepared my presentation, I thought about Maya, about Emma, about all the others who had trusted us with their stories. The meeting room at the State House was intimidating, all dark wood and historical gravitas. But as I stood before the legislative committee, sharing statistics and stories, I felt none of the fear that had once paralyzed me. This was my purpose now, turning personal pain into systemic change. One of the legislators, a woman in her 60s, stayed behind after the formal presentation. "Your story," she said, adjusting her glasses. "It reminds me of my mother's, She lost everything to a trusted family member while battling cancer. Back then, there were no resources like your center. She never recovered from the betrayal. But maybe, with these changes we're discussing, other women won't have to go through what she did. That evening, walking home through the gentle spring rain, I felt a profound sense of connection to all the women who had faced similar battles. Those who had lost, those who had won, those still fighting. The rain created halos around the streetlights, and the wet cobblestones reflected the city lights like scattered stars. Jessica had invited me over for dinner, a standing Thursday tradition we'd maintained even after I'd moved into my own place. Her condo, once my refuge, now felt like visiting an old friend. Familiar and comfortable, but no longer necessary for survival. Over homemade risotto and wine, we talked about the day's events. Jessica had news of her own. The hospital was considering expanding the advocacy program to other facilities in their network. They're calling it the Thompson Protocol, she said with a hint of pride. Every patient with an extended stay will be automatically screened for financial and legal vulnerabilities. The name struck me as fitting. Patricia Thompson had tried to destroy me, but instead, her actions had sparked a movement that would protect countless others. It was a legacy she never intended to create, but one that would far outlast her. Later that night, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through real estate listings. Not for myself this time, but researching property values for a case we were handling. A familiar address caught my eye. My old house was back on the market. The yellow door was still cheerful in the listing photos, the window boxes still bright with flowers. For a moment, I let myself remember the dreams I'd had for that house, the life I'd planned within its walls. But the memories no longer hurt. They felt like scenes from someone else's story, a book I'd read long ago but no longer needed to keep, on my shelf. My phone lit up with a text from Dr. Martinez. A new patient had been admitted, a woman who'd been in a car accident similar to mine. She was asking for me specifically, having read about the advocacy center in a hospital brochure. Some stories need to be heard by someone who understands, Sarah wrote. Are you up for a visit tomorrow? Of course I was. These moments, these connections, were what gave meaning to everything I'd endured. Each person who found their way to us was an opportunity to transform pain into purpose, fear into strength, isolation into community. The next morning, I stopped by the local coffee shop before heading to the hospital. The owner, Maria, knew my usual order and had it ready before I reached the counter. You're wearing your warrior face today, she observed with a knowing smile. She wasn't wrong. Some days required extra armor, even if that armor was just a perfectly made latte and a determined spirit. The hospital corridors felt different now. Where I'd once hurried through them focused solely on medical tasks, I now saw them as spaces where lives could change in an instant, where vulnerability could either break someone or become their strength. The patient I was visiting, Sandra, was still in the early stages of trauma, physical and emotional. Her room was dim, the morning light barely penetrating the drawn blinds. Her husband sat beside her bed, holding her hand, his face etched with worry. I recognized that look too. The helpless anguish of watching someone you love suffer while feeling powerless to protect them. As I shared my story with Sandra and her husband, I could see the moment understanding dawned in their eyes. The realization that they weren't alone, that there were people who understood their fears and knew how to help them navigate this uncertain territory. By the time I left, they had appointments scheduled with both legal and financial advisors from our center. Back at my office, I found Emily waiting for me. She'd brought lunch, her way of marking the anniversary of Patricia's sentencing. We didn't talk about her mother much these days, but today felt different. I visited her last week, Emily said, unwrapping her sandwich. She's different, smaller somehow. She talked about you, actually. Said she underestimated you. Coming from her, that's practically an apology. I let that information settle, trying to find where it fit in my emotional landscape. Patricia's opinion of me no longer held any power, but her recognition of her own mistakes felt like the closing of a circle. "How does it feel?" I asked Emily, being free of her influence. Emily's smile was genuine, if a bit sad, like waking up from a long dream. Sometimes I catch myself thinking, what would Mom say about something, and then I remember, her opinion doesn't matter anymore. I get to choose who I want to be. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with our expanding team. The Advocacy Center had grown to include social workers, financial advisors, and legal experts. Each team member brought their own perspective, their own expertise, their own commitment to protecting vulnerable patients. As I listened to them discuss cases and strategies, I felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just my vision anymore. It had become a shared mission, a collective dedication to ensuring that no one had to face their darkest moments alone. The day ended with a support group session, a new addition to our services. The group met in what we called the Hope Room, a warm space with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. Today's topic was rebuilding trust after betrayal. As the participants shared their stories, I was struck by the common thread that ran through them all: the need to believe in goodness again, to risk vulnerability after being burned. Walking home in the gathering dusk, I thought about trust and how my relationship with it had evolved. I was more cautious now, yes, but also more discerning. Trust wasn't something to be given blindly or withheld completely. It was a skill to be developed, a muscle to be strengthened through careful exercise. My brownstone welcomed me home with its familiar creaks and shadows. The evening light caught the crystals I'd hung in the windows, sending rainbow patterns dancing across the walls. This space, unlike my old house, didn't hold memories of betrayal. Every corner reflected choices I'd made, changes I'd initiated, growth I'd achieved. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with an email from Caroline. She'd drafted the initial proposal for what we were calling the Medical Vulnerability Protection Act, legislation aimed at closing the loopholes that allowed people like Patricia to exploit patients during their most vulnerable moments. Reading. Through the draft, I felt a sense of completion. Not an ending. There would always be more work to do, more people to help, more battles to fight. But a recognition that something meaningful had grown from the ashes of my own trauma. Patricia had tried to take everything from me, but in doing so, she'd given me something far more valuable: a purpose. The city lights twinkled beyond my windows, each one perhaps marking another story, another struggle, another opportunity for transformation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new clients, new chances to turn pain into power. But for now, in the quiet of my own space, I was exactly where I needed to be: strong, centered, and ready for whatever came next. Summer arrived in Boston with a wave of humid air that made the brownstone's old walls sweat. I'd taken to working early mornings at the Advocacy Center, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of possibility while reviewing case files. The quiet hours before the office officially opened had become my time for reflection and planning. This morning's solitude was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Through the glass doors, I saw a familiar figure: Patricia's former colleague, Robert Chen, from the real estate agency. He stood hesitantly at the entrance, his usual confident demeanor notably absent. My finger hovered over the security buzzer as I debated whether to let him in. Robert had been one of the few who'd testified against Patricia willingly, without needing a subpoena. His testimony had revealed crucial details about her broader network of fraud. Still, seeing him brought back memories I'd rather leave buried. After a moment's hesitation, I pressed the buzzer. "I'm sorry to come so early," he said, settling into one of the visitor chairs in my office, "but I needed to speak with you privately." He pulled out a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. We found more documents in the agency's old storage unit. Things Patricia had hidden years ago. There are other victims, Rachel. People who never knew they were deceived. The envelope contained property records dating back 15 years. Each page told a story of manipulation and fraud, each signature a testament to misplaced trust. But these weren't just papers. They were lives disrupted, dreams shattered, security stolen. My hands trembled slightly as I read through the puis-oz. Why bring these to me? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Because you built something here, something that helps people. And these people, they deserve to know the truth. They deserve a chance at justice. By the time Jessica arrived for our morning meeting, I'd already called Caroline and begun digitizing the documents. This would mean reopening wounds, launching new investigations, stirring up a past that some might prefer to leave buried. But truth, I'd learned, had a way of demanding to be heard. The day unfolded in a blur of activity. Caroline arrived with her team of paralegals, setting up a makeshift command center in our conference room. Dr. Martinez cleared her schedule to help us identify potential medical connections in the cases. Even Emily came by, offering to help cross-reference names with her mother's old social circles. As we worked, patterns emerged. Patricia had particularly targeted families dealing with medical crises, people too preoccupied with health concerns to notice financial manipulation. She'd used hospital records, obtained through who knows what means, to identify vulnerable targets. The scope of her operation was even larger than we'd imagined. Around midday, my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to James Foster, a reporter from the Globe who'd covered Patricia's trial. I heard rumors about new evidence, he said without preamble. Care to comment? I'd learned to be cautious with the press, but James had always reported fairly on our work. We agreed to meet at a small cafe around the corner from the center. Over coffee, I explained what we'd discovered, careful to protect the identities of potential victims while emphasizing the systemic nature of the fraud. This isn't just about Patricia anymore, I explained, watching him take notes. It's about exposing how these schemes work, how they target people at their most vulnerable moments. It's about preventing it from happening again. James looked up from his notebook, his expression thoughtful. You know, when I first covered your story, I thought it was an isolated incident. Dramatic, but isolated. Now I'm seeing it's part of something much bigger. Would you be willing to work with me on a series of articles? Really dive deep into this issue? The proposition was both exciting and terrifying. More publicity meant more scrutiny, more questions, more painful memories dredged up. But it also meant more awareness, more potential for change, more people learning to protect themselves. That evening, as I locked up the office, I noticed a woman lingering near the entrance. She seemed uncertain, clutching a newspaper clipping that I recognized as one of the articles about Patricia's trial. When she saw me, she straightened up, squaring her shoulders. "Ms. Thompson?" she asked, then quickly corrected herself. I know that's not your name anymore. I'm Margaret Wells. Patricia Thompson handled my mother's estate sale 10 years ago. I've always felt something wasn't right, but I could never prove it. When I read about what she did to you, we ended up talking for hours. Margaret's story had eerie parallels to others we'd uncovered. A vulnerable family, a trusted professional, documents that never quite added up. By the time she left, she had an appointment with Caroline and a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. James's articles began running in the Globe, each one generating new leads, new stories, new connections. The Advocacy Center's phone rang constantly. Emily helped us set up a dedicated hotline for people who suspected they might have been victims of similar schemes. One morning, I arrived at the center to find a small group of people waiting outside. They weren't clients or reporters. They were former victims of Patricia's schemes, people who'd already been through our program. They'd organized themselves into a support network, meeting regularly to share resources and encouragement. "We want to volunteer," their spokesperson, a retired teacher named Grace, explained. "We've been where these people are. We know what it feels like to doubt yourself, to wonder if you're crazy for suspecting something's wrong. Maybe we can help." Their offer touched something deep inside me. This was how healing happened, not just through legal victories or financial settlements, but through connection, through turning victims into advocates, through transforming pain into purpose. We created a peer support program, training former clients to mentor new ones. The initiative quickly became one of our most successful services. There was something powerful about hearing "I believe you" from someone who'd walked a similar path. Caroline's office became a hub of activity as she coordinated multiple legal actions. The new evidence had opened possibilities for additional charges against Patricia. But more importantly, it provided leverage for civil suits that could help victims recover their losses. One afternoon, as I was reviewing case files, Jessica appeared in my doorway. "Have you seen this?" she asked, holding up her tablet. On the screen was an article from a legal journal discussing what they called the Boston Model, our advocacy center's approach to protecting vulnerable patients from financial exploitation. They're implementing similar programs in hospitals across the country, Jessica continued, her eyes bright with excitement. "You've started a movement, Rachel. This is becoming the new standard of care." The realization was overwhelming. What had begun as a response to personal trauma had grown into something that was changing the very structure of patient protection. Other hospitals were reaching out, asking for guidance and setting up their own advocacy programs. That evening, I decided to walk home instead of taking my usual rideshare. The summer air was thick with humidity, but I needed time to process everything that was happening. My route took me past my old house, something I no longer avoided. The yellow door had been repainted a deep blue, and the window boxes now overflowed with bright red geraniums. A child's bicycle leaned against the front steps. Life had moved on within those walls, creating new stories, new memories. Just as I had. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily. She'd been doing some digging and had found something interesting, a pattern of similar fraud cases in other states. The perpetrators used different methods, but the basic strategy was the same, targeting families dealing with medical crises. "We need to think bigger," she wrote. "This isn't just about mom anymore. It's about changing the whole system." She was right, of course. We'd been so focused on local cases that we'd missed the broader picture. This was happening everywhere, in different forms, but with the same devastating impact on vulnerable families. The next morning, I called an emergency staff meeting. The conference room quickly filled with our team: legal experts, social workers, financial advisors, peer supporters. On the wall-mounted screen, I displayed a map showing similar cases across the country. "We have an opportunity here," I began, looking at the faces around the table. "We've built something that works. Now we need to share it, scale it, make it accessible to everyone who needs it." The discussion that followed was intense and productive. Ideas flowed freely: training programs for other hospitals, online, resources for remote communities, partnerships with national organizations. By the end of the meeting, we had the outline of a national initiative. Caroline stayed behind after others left, perching on the edge of my desk. "You know what this means, don't you?" she asked. "More publicity, more speaking engagements, more attention, not just on the program, but on you personally. Are you ready for that?" The question gave me pause. For so long, I'd focused on helping others tell their stories. The thought of stepping into the spotlight myself was daunting. But if my story could help create change on a national level, didn't I have an obligation to share it? That night, unable to sleep, I sat on my balcony watching the city lights. The air was heavy with approaching rain, and distant thunder rolled across the sky. In the quiet darkness, I thought about all the people still out there, facing their own battles, not knowing where to turn for help. My phone lit up with a message from Dr. Martinez. A patient was being admitted. Another car accident victim. Another life suddenly thrown into uncertainty. But this time, thanks to our program, she wouldn't face that uncertainty alone. She would have advocates, supporters, protectors from the moment she arrived. The first drops of rain began to fall as I made my decision. If sharing my story could help others find their way through darkness to light, then that's what I would do. Not because I wanted attention or recognition, but because sometimes the best way to heal ourselves is to help others heal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to create change. But for now, I sat in the rain-scented darkness, feeling grateful for every step of my journey, even the painful ones. Because without them, I wouldn't be who I am now, wouldn't be doing what I do now, wouldn't be able to help others find their way to strength and justice. The thunder grew closer, and the rain fell harder, but I stayed on the balcony, letting the storm wash over me. Sometimes I'd learned, you have to weather the storm to see the rainbow. And sometimes the storm itself makes you stronger. The autumn leaves danced across the courtyard of the Massachusetts State House as I prepared to testify before the Legislative Committee. The Medical Vulnerability Protection Act had gained unexpected momentum, attracting bipartisan support and national attention. Today's hearing would determine whether our state would become the first to enact comprehensive protections for patients facing financial exploitation during health crises. My testimony notes felt heavy in my hands as I waited in the marble hallway. The grand portraits of past governors looked down with solemn expressions, silent witnesses to countless moments of change. A young legislative aide approached, clipboard in hand, to inform me they were ready. Inside the hearing room, cameras clicked and reporters scribbled as I took my seat at the witness table. The room's rich wood paneling and green leather chairs carried the weight of history, but today they would hear a different kind of story, one of modern predators and digital age exploitation. Senator Eleanor Maxwell, the committee chair, leaned forward in her seat. Ms. Mitchell, please proceed with your testimony. The microphone carried my voice across the hushed chamber as I began sharing not just my story, but the stories of hundreds of others who'd found their way to our advocacy center. As I spoke, I noticed a familiar face in the audience, James Foster from the Globe, who'd become an unexpected ally in our fight for reform. Beside him sat Margaret Wells, Grace Thompson, and other survivors who'd chosen to attend, forming a silent chorus of support. The questions from legislators were pointed and practical. How would these protections be implemented? What would they cost? How would they affect legitimate property transactions? I had anticipated these concerns, armed with data from our center's cases and research from similar programs in other countries. During a brief recess, I stepped into the hallway for water and found myself face to face with a silver-haired man in an expensive suit. Richard Blackwood, he introduced himself, extending his hand. I represent the Massachusetts Association of Realtors. We need to talk. My guard instantly rose. The Realtors Association had been our strongest opposition, claiming the proposed regulations would hamper legitimate business. But Richard's expression held none of the hostility I'd expected. Your testimony. It made me think of my sister, he said quietly. She lost everything while battling cancer last year. Maybe if these protections had been in place. Back inside the hearing room, Richard requested to speak. To everyone's surprise, he announced the association's support for the bill, with some minor amendments. The energy in the room shifted palpably. This was no longer just a victim's crusade, but a collaborative effort for change. The day's final surprise came from an unexpected quarter. a junior representative from Western Massachusetts, approached me after the hearing. "My office has been researching similar cases nationwide," she said, handing me a thick folder. "This isn't just a Massachusetts problem. We need federal legislation." That evening, as I reviewed the representative's research in my brownstone study, the scope of what we were undertaking began to sink in. Property records from Florida showed similar patterns of exploitation. Case files from California revealed elaborate schemes targeting hospital patients. News clippings from Texas documented stories that eerily mirrored my own. A text from Emily broke my concentration. "Turn on Channel 5 now." The evening news was running a feature on the hearing, but it wasn't just about the legislation. They were highlighting the broader movement our advocacy center had sparked. Similar programs springing up in other states, hospitals revising their patient protection protocols, law enforcement creating specialized units for medical-related fraud. The reporter ended the segment with a question that caught me off guard. Is Boston becoming the epicenter of a national revolution in patient protection? The words hung in the air as I sat in my dimly lit study, surrounded by papers documenting both tragedy and triumph. My phone began buzzing with messages. Dr. Martinez had seen the news and wanted to discuss expanding our program. Caroline had ideas about coordinating with advocacy groups in other states. Jessica suggested creating a national training program for hospital staff. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Fall in Boston had always been my favorite season, but this year it felt especially significant. A season of change, of letting go, of new beginnings. The Advocacy Center's waiting room was already full when I arrived, each person clutching papers, carrying stories, seeking hope. Among them sat a woman who looked achingly familiar, the same defeated posture, the same haunted eyes I'd once seen in my own reflection. Her name was Claire, and her story emerged in broken phrases. A sudden illness, a trusted family member, missing documents, a house sold without consent. But unlike my story, hers was still in progress, the damage not yet complete. Within hours, our team had mobilized. Caroline's legal assistants began tracking down property records. Our financial advisors froze suspicious transactions. Social workers connected Claire with emergency housing resources. This was what we'd built, a safety net for those falling through society's cracks. Mid-morning brought an unexpected visitor to my office. Thomas, Patricia's former assistant, had driven up from New York where he'd started a new life. "I saw you on the news yesterday," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I've been thinking about all the other cases, all the times I stayed silent." His voice trailed off, heavy with old guilt, but his next words carried hope. "I want to help. I know how these schemes work from the inside. Maybe that knowledge could help prevent others from falling victim." The offer was tempting but complicated. Thomas's involvement with Patricia's crimes, though under duress, made him a controversial figure. Yet his insider knowledge could be invaluable in training others to spot warning signs and understand predator tactics. Over lunch with Jessica and Dr. Martinez, we discussed the possibility of creating a prevention education program. Thomas's insights, combined with our case experiences, could help people recognize and avoid exploitation before it began. Sometimes, Dr. Martinez observed, the best medicine is prevention. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with hospital administrators from across the state. Our program was growing faster than we could handle, and we needed to scale effectively without losing the personal touch that made our approach successful. Each survivor's story was unique. Each case required individual attention. As we discussed logistics and resources, I found my thoughts drifting to the broader implications of our work. We weren't just helping individuals anymore. We were changing the very system that had allowed exploitation to flourish. Each policy revision, each new protection, each trained advocate represented a small but significant victory. Between meetings, I received an email that made my heart skip. The subject line read, "Statement from Patricia Thompson." My finger hovered over the delete button, but curiosity won out. The message was brief, forwarded through her prison's email system. "You've built something remarkable from the ruins I created. Perhaps that's justice enough." The words stirred something unexpected in me. Not anger or vindication, but a quiet acknowledgement that even the darkest experiences could lead to light. Patricia's actions had set me on this path, but I had chosen to walk it, to transform it from a journey of survival into one of purpose. Evening found me in the center's conference room, surrounded by our expanded team as we planned the next phase of our work. The walls were covered with charts and maps showing the spread of our program's influence. String-connected pushpins representing partner hospitals, advocacy groups, and legal clinics across the country. Maria, our newest staff member and a former client, stood presenting her ideas for community outreach. Her confidence had grown remarkably since she'd first walked through our doors 4 months ago. Now she was helping others find their own strength, their own voice, their own path to recovery. As the meeting wound down, Grace approached with news from the support group network. They'd organized a fundraising gala for the winter, aimed at establishing a scholarship fund for survivors seeking education or career training. Because sometimes, she explained, the best revenge is living well and helping others do the same. The sun had set by the time I left the office, the city lights twinkling like earthbound stars. A text from Emily was waiting on my phone. "Mom asked about you again today. She seems different, smaller, maybe even sorry." I typed back a simple response. "The past is past. We're building the future." Walking home through the cooling evening, I passed several construction sites where old buildings were being renovated, transformed, given new purpose. It felt like a metaphor for our work, taking damaged foundations and building something stronger, more resilient, more meaningful. My brownstone welcomed me with its familiar warmth. The living room walls, once bare, now held framed newspaper articles about our work, awards from advocacy organizations, and most importantly, letters from people we'd helped. Each one represented a life touched, a story changed, a future reclaimed. Settling into my favorite reading chair, I opened my laptop to review the draft of the National Initiative proposal. The words blurred slightly as fatigue set in, but the vision remained clear. We were creating more than just a program or a policy. We were building a movement, a community, a legacy of protection and empowerment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to affect change. But tonight, in the quiet of my own space, I felt the full circle of my journey. From victim to survivor to advocate to leader, each role building on the last, each experience adding depth and purpose to the next. The city sounds drifted up from the street below, traffic, voices, the distant wail of a siren. Somewhere out there, someone else was facing their moment of crisis, their time of vulnerability. But because of what we'd built, they wouldn't have to face it alone. That knowledge, more than any personal triumph, made every step of my journey worthwhile. A light dusting of early winter snow coated Boston as I stepped onto the stage at the National Conference on Patient Rights. The convention center's grand ballroom was packed with medical professionals, legal experts, and advocates from across the country. My keynote speech notes felt like they were burning a hole in my pocket, but I'd decided to speak from the heart instead. Looking out at the sea of faces, I spotted familiar ones among the crowd. Dr. Martinez sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Caroline had taken a break from her busy schedule to attend. Even James Foster from the Globe was there, pen poised over his notepad, ready to document this milestone moment. The microphone picked up my voice as I began sharing not just my personal journey, but the collective stories of thousands who'd found their way to our network of advocacy centers. Each case represented a life disrupted, a trust betrayed, but also a chance for redemption and rebuilding. Midway through my speech, the door at the back of the ballroom opened quietly. Through the bright stage lights, I caught a glimpse of Daniel, slipping into a rear seat. My former husband looked older, grayer, his shoulders carrying the weight of choices made and paths not taken. For a moment, our eyes met across the crowded room, and I felt nothing but peaceful indifference. After the speech, during the reception, a group of hospital administrators from Chicago approached me. They'd been following our work and wanted to implement similar programs in their facilities. "The statistics from your pilot programs are impossible to ignore," their leader said, passing me a business card. "We need this in every major hospital." The morning's success was celebrated over lunch with Jessica and Dr. Martinez at our favorite North End restaurant. The tiny Italian place had become our unofficial meeting spot for milestone moments. As we shared plates of handmade pasta, Jessica revealed her own news. She'd been promoted to chief patient advocate for the entire hospital network. Back at the advocacy center that afternoon, I found Maria training a new group of peer supporters. The program had grown beyond our wildest expectations, with former clients stepping up to mentor others through their healing journeys. The sight of them gathered around the conference table, sharing experiences and strategies, filled me with quiet pride. A call from Emily interrupted my afternoon meetings. Her voice was tight with emotion as she shared the latest update about Patricia. "Mom's health is failing," she said quietly. "The prison doctor gives her maybe 6 months. She's asking to see you." The request hung in the air like smoke, heavy with unspoken implications. That evening, walking home through gently falling snow, I pondered Patricia's request. The woman who had tried to destroy my life now wanted what exactly? Forgiveness? Understanding? Closure? The brownstone's warm lights beckoned as I climbed the steps, still turning the question over in my mind. Inside, I found an unexpected package waiting. The return address was from a law firm in Seattle, accompanying a letter that would open yet another chapter in our expanding mission. A group of attorneys there had uncovered a pattern of medical identity theft targeting hospital patients. They wanted to collaborate on developing preventive protocols. The next morning dawned clear and cold. The advocacy center's waiting room was already filling up as I arrived, earlier than usual. Among the familiar faces was a new one. A young man clutching a folder of documents, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. His story would prove to be the catalyst for our next major initiative. Michael Chen was a second-year medical resident who'd discovered suspicious patterns in patient financial records. Someone within the hospital system was using medical emergencies as cover for identity theft and property fraud. The scheme was sophisticated, targeting patients during their most vulnerable moments, much like Patricia had done. Caroline arrived. Within the hour, her legal mind already racing with possibilities. This wasn't just another case. It was evidence of a systemic problem that crossed state lines and jurisdictions. As she reviewed Michael's documentation, her expression grew increasingly serious. "This is organized crime masquerading as healthcare fraud," she concluded. By midday, our conference room had transformed into a command center. Dr. Martinez coordinated with hospital security teams across the network. Jessica accessed patient records, looking for similar patterns. Emily, logging in remotely, cross-referenced property transactions with hospital admission dates. A text message from Daniel interrupted our investigation. "I heard about Patricia's request," he wrote. "Whatever you decide, I support you. I owe you that much at least." The message stirred no emotion. Just another piece of data in a life that had moved far beyond our shared past. Late afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Senator Maxwell, who'd championed our legislation at the state level. She arrived without fanfare, having heard about the identity theft investigation. "This could be the push we need for federal legislation," she said, studying our wall of evidence. "How quickly can you prepare a presentation for Congress?" The question sparked a flurry of activity. Our team worked late into the evening, compiling data, preparing testimonials, crafting recommendations. The scope of our work was expanding again, moving from individual advocacy to systemic change at the national level. Around midnight, as the last of our team headed home, I found myself alone in my office, staring at Patricia's prison photo on my computer screen. The woman who had catalyzed this entire journey looked small and frail, nothing like the towering figure who had once dominated my nightmares. Morning brought fresh snow and fresh perspective. Over breakfast at my favorite corner cafe, I drafted my response to Patricia's request. The words came easily, flowing from a place of strength rather than anger or fear. I would see her, not for her sake, but for mine, to close this chapter fully and finally. The day unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. Our investigation into the medical identity theft ring had uncovered connections to similar operations in 3 other states. Caroline coordinated with federal prosecutors while our team worked to protect potential targets and support identified victims. Mid-morning, a call came from Thomas in New York. He'd been implementing our protection protocols in several hospitals there and had identified a pattern we'd missed. The identity thieves weren't just targeting patients. They were placing accomplices in hospital administrative positions, creating a network of insider threats. This revelation led to a complete overhaul of our screening recommendations. Jessica spearheaded the development of new background check procedures, while Dr. Martinez worked with hospital HR departments to implement enhanced security measures. The predators were evolving, but so were we. Lunch brought a meeting with Grace and her support group leadership team. They'd organized a network of safe houses for victims of financial exploitation, providing temporary shelter and resources. During legal proceedings, the project perfectly complemented our advocacy work, adding another layer of practical support to our services. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through my office windows as I reviewed the latest draft of our congressional testimony. Senator Maxwell's staff had been incredibly supportive, helping us frame our findings in ways that would resonate with legislators from both parties. The issues we were addressing transcended political divisions, touching on universal human vulnerabilities. A knock at my door revealed Maria, excitement evident in her expression. The peer support program had received official certification from the state, meaning our training protocols would become the standard for similar programs nationwide. It was another small victory in our larger battle for comprehensive patient protection. Evening found me in the hospital chapel, a quiet space I'd discovered during my own recovery. The peaceful atmosphere helped clear my mind as I prepared for tomorrow's visit with Patricia. The decision to see her wasn't about forgiveness. It was about demonstrating the power of moving forward, of transforming pain into purpose. Back home, I discovered an email from Claire, one of our first clients after opening the advocacy center. She'd not only recovered her property, but had gone on to law school, inspired by her experience with us. Her message included a draft of her thesis on patient rights and financial protection laws, dedicated to our center's work. The night wrapped me in quiet contemplation as I sat in my study, surrounded by the evidence of how far we'd come. Photos of successful cases lined the walls, alongside news clippings and thank you letters. Each item represented a life touched, a story changed, a future reclaimed from the brink of despair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The prison visit, the ongoing investigation, the congressional preparation. But tonight, in the peaceful solitude of my home, I felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The journey that had begun with one woman's betrayal had grown into a movement that was changing lives across the nation. A text from Jessica reminded me of our early morning meeting with hospital administrators. We would be presenting our findings on the identity theft ring and proposing new security measures. The work never really stopped, but that was okay. This was no longer just a job or a mission. It was my life's purpose. The snow continued falling outside my window, coating the city in pristine white. Somewhere out there, others were facing their own moments of crisis, their own battles for justice. But because of what we'd built, they wouldn't have to fight alone. That knowledge made every struggle, every setback, every moment of doubt worthwhile. In my bedroom, I laid out my outfit for tomorrow's prison visit. Professional, confident, armor against whatever emotional storms might come. The woman who would wear these clothes was not the same one Patricia had tried to destroy. She was stronger, wiser, more purposeful. She was a builder of solutions, a protector of the vulnerable, a voice for the voiceless. The city lights twinkled through the falling snow, each one perhaps marking another story waiting to be changed, another life waiting to be restored. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and triumphs, but tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, I was exactly where I needed to be, strong, centered, and ready for whatever lay ahead. The prison waiting room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Gray winter light filtered through wire-reinforced windows, casting shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Emily sat beside me, her presence both comforting and necessary. She would be my witness to whatever unfolded in this meeting with Patricia. A guard called my name, her voice echoing off concrete walls. The security screening was thorough but impersonal, a reminder that this place stripped everyone of their outside identities. My visitor's badge felt heavy against my chest as we were led through a series of locked doors, each one closing behind us with a definitive clang. The meeting room was smaller than I'd imagined, furnished with only a metal table and 4 plastic chairs. Patricia was already there, wearing standard-issue beige, her once perfect hair now completely gray. She looked up as we entered, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, regret, perhaps even fear. "Rachel," she said, her voice raspier than I remembered. "Thank you for coming." Emily squeezed my hand before taking her seat slightly behind us, close enough to intervene but giving us space for whatever needed to be said. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. I studied the woman who had once wielded such power over my life. Prison had erased her carefully maintained facade of sophistication. Without her designer clothes and perfect makeup, she seemed smaller, almost fragile. Her hands, resting on the table, showed age spots and trembled slightly. "The doctors say, I have advanced pancreatic cancer," Patricia began, her words careful and measured. 6 months, maybe less. I've spent a lot of time thinking about everything. The choices I made, the people I hurt. She paused, struggling with words that once came so easily to her. "I've watched you, through the news, through Emily, what you've built." A young guard shifted position by the door, his keys jingling softly. Outside, the muffled sounds of prison life continued. Footsteps, distant voices, the metallic sounds of security, doors. Inside our small room, time seemed suspended as Patricia gathered her thoughts. "I never expected you to survive what I did to you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let alone thrive, create something meaningful, help others. I thought I was so clever, so powerful. But you turned my worst actions into something remarkable." The words hung in the air between us. I could feel Emily's tension behind. Me could sense her readiness to step in if needed. But this moment belonged to me, and I knew exactly what I wanted to say. "I didn't come here for your approval, Patricia," I said, my voice steady, "or your admiration, or even your remorse. I came because I wanted you to see me, really see me. Not as your victim, not as Daniel's ex-wife, but as who I am now. Someone who took everything you tried to destroy and built something stronger." Patricia's hands clenched on the table, her knuckles white. "I know," she replied. "That's why I asked you to come. I needed to see it for myself, to understand how someone could rise above such calculated cruelty." She looked down at her hands, then back at my face. "I've hurt so many people, Rachel. You're just the one who fought back." The conversation shifted to other victims. Names, dates, details that could help our center identify and assist others Patricia had targeted over the years. She spoke without pride now, listing her crimes with the detachment of someone cataloging past mistakes. Emily took notes, her pen scratching quietly against paper. As the meeting drew to a close, Patricia attempted one final connection. "In a strange way," she said, "you've accomplished everything I wanted for Daniel. Success, respect, influence. But you did it honestly, helping others instead of hurting them." A bitter smile crossed her face. Maybe that's the real irony here. Standing to leave, I felt no triumph, no vindication, not even pity. Just a profound sense of completion, of circles closing. The guard stepped forward to escort us out, his keys ready. Patricia remained seated, suddenly looking every day of her age and illness. "Goodbye, Patricia," I said simply. "I hope you find peace with your choices." Emily touched my shoulder as we turned to leave, her presence grounding me in the present moment. The sound of the door closing behind us echoed with finality. The drive back to Boston was quiet, snow beginning to fall in large, lazy flakes. Emily broke the silence first. "Are you okay?" she asked, glancing away from the road briefly to study my face. I nodded, watching the familiar landmarks of the city emerge through the growing storm. Back at the Advocacy Center, life continued, its forward momentum. A group of medical students was attending our training session on identifying financial exploitation. Maria led the presentation, her confidence growing with each successful program. The sight of young professionals taking notes, asking questions, learning to protect their future patients, felt like the perfect antidote to the morning's heavy emotions. Caroline arrived mid-afternoon with updates on our latest cases. The identity theft investigation had led to several arrests, and more victims were coming forward daily. Our support network was expanding to meet the growing need, with new centers opening in neighboring states. As we reviewed case files in my office, Jessica appeared in the doorway, her expression urgent. "You need to see this," she said, tablet in hand. The screen showed breaking news. Another major hospital network had uncovered a fraud ring similar to the one we were investigating. The sophistication of their operation confirmed our worst fears about the scope of the problem. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Conference calls with law enforcement, meetings with hospital security teams, coordination with our growing network of advocacy centers. Each new development reinforced the importance of our work, the need for continued vigilance and expansion. Evening found me in the hospital chapel again, this time accompanied by Dr. Martinez. The quiet space had become our unofficial retreat for processing difficult days. Sarah listened as I described the prison meeting, her presence offering the comfort of long friendship and shared purpose. "You know," she said after I finished, "what you did today, facing Patricia, that's going to help others find their courage too. Every time you share your story, every time you show your strength, you make it easier for someone else to fight back." Walking home through the snowy evening, I reflected on her words. The Advocacy Center had grown far beyond my personal story of survival, but that story remained its foundation. Each new case, each victim who found their way to us, connected back to that moment of vulnerability and the strength that grew from it. My phone buzzed with a message from Claire. She'd been accepted to 3 law schools and wanted my advice on which program would best support her goal of practicing advocacy law. Another circle completing itself, another survivor turning their experience into purpose. The brownstone welcomed me with warmth and silence. In my study, the wall of success, stories had grown again, new photos, new letters, new victories. Each one represented a life redirected from victim to survivor, from powerless to powerful. The sight filled me with renewed energy despite the day's emotional drain. A late-night email arrived from Senator Maxwell's office. The congressional hearing was scheduled for next month. Our testimony would be crucial in pushing through new federal protections for vulnerable patients. The scope of potential change was both exciting and daunting. As I prepared for bed, my phone lit up with one final message from Daniel. "Emily told me about today," he wrote. "I'm sorry I never had your courage." The words sparked no pain, no regret, just quiet acknowledgement of growth and change. I left the message unanswered, another chapter quietly closing. Sleep came easily that night, untroubled by the ghosts of past betrayals. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to create change. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness of my home, I felt the full circle of my journey, from victim to survivor to advocate to leader. The snow continued falling outside, coating the city in fresh possibility. Somewhere out there, others were facing their own moments of crisis, their own battles for justice. Because of what we'd built, they wouldn't have to fight alone. That knowledge made every step of this journey, even today's difficult reunion, worthwhile. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and triumphs, but tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, I was exactly where I needed to be, strong, centered, and ready for whatever lay ahead. The woman who had lost everything had found something far more valuable: purpose, strength, and the power to create lasting change. Washington, D.C. gleamed under early spring sunshine as I climbed the steps of the Capitol building. The magnitude of the moment wasn't lost on me. Testifying before Congress about patient protection legislation felt worlds away from those dark days in the hospital. Caroline walked beside me, her briefcase containing months of research and documentation that would support our testimony. Inside the historic building, the air hummed with purposeful energy. Congressional staffers hurried through marble hallways, their footsteps echoing off walls that had witnessed centuries of American history. Our small team, including Dr. Martinez and Jessica, followed a young aide to the hearing room. The chamber itself was intimidating: rich wood paneling, imposing portraits, television cameras positioned strategically around the room. Committee members shuffled papers and whispered among themselves as we took our seats at the witness table. Names plaques identified us: Rachel Mitchell, Director of Patient Advocacy Programs; Dr. Sarah Martinez, Chief of Medicine; Caroline Walsh, Legal Counsel. Chairman Roberts called the hearing to order, his gavel cracked sharp in the hushed room. Today's hearing addresses proposed legislation to protect vulnerable medical patients from financial exploitation, he began. Our first witness is Rachel Mitchell, whose personal experience and subsequent advocacy work have brought this issue to national attention. The microphone picked up my voice as I began speaking, sharing not just statistics and case studies, but the human stories behind them. Each example illustrated how predators targeted people during medical crises, exploiting their vulnerability for financial gain. The committee members leaned forward, their expressions intent. Questions from the representatives were probing and sometimes challenging. A congressman from Texas worried about overregulation. A representative from California wanted details about implementation costs. Each query required careful response, balancing urgency with practicality. During a brief recess, Senator Maxwell approached our table. "You've made quite an impression," she said quietly. "Several members who were on the fence are now asking about co-sponsoring the bill." Her words offered hope, but we knew the real battle was still ahead. The afternoon session brought opposition testimony from industry groups concerned about additional regulations. Their arguments were polished, their statistics carefully selected, but they couldn't counter the power of real stories. The elderly man who lost his home while undergoing cancer treatment, the young mother whose identity was stolen during emergency surgery. As the hearing concluded, reporters gathered in the hallway, microphones extended eagerly. James Foster from the Globe was there, along with journalists from major networks. Their questions focused not just on the legislation, but on the broader movement our work had sparked. Back at our hotel that evening, the team gathered in my suite to decompress and strategize. Room service plates littered the coffee table as we discussed next steps. The hearing was just the beginning. Now came the real work of building support and addressing concerns. My phone lit up with a message from Emily. Patricia's condition had worsened. Doctors gave her weeks rather than months. The news stirred complex emotions, but I pushed them aside to focus on our current mission. Some chapters needed to close themselves. Dawn found me unable to sleep, standing at my hotel window watching the capital city wake up. The Washington Monument pierced the pink morning sky like an exclamation point. Below, early joggers circled. The National Mall, their breath visible in the cool spring air. Today's schedule included meetings with key congressional staff members, working to address concerns raised during the hearing. Caroline had prepared detailed responses to every objection, supported by data from our years of advocacy work. Dr. Martinez would handle medical questions, while Jessica focused on implementation logistics. The first meeting, with the House Majority Whip's office, started promisingly. His healthcare policy advisor took copious notes as we outlined how the proposed protections would work within existing hospital systems. The cost-benefit analysis particularly caught their attention. Prevention proved far less expensive than trying to recover stolen assets. Mid-morning brought unexpected support from an influential medical association. Their representative arrived at our temporary office in the Hart Senate building with data showing how financial stress impacted patient recovery rates. Their endorsement would carry significant weight with undecided legislators. Lunch was a working session with Senator Maxwell's team, fine-tuning language to address concerns about implementation. Every word mattered. Too strict, and we'd lose moderate support. Too loose, and the protections would be meaningless. The Senator's legal staff proved invaluable in finding the right balance. A call from the Advocacy Center interrupted our afternoon strategy session. Maria had identified another pattern in recent cases. Predators were adapting to existing protections, finding new ways to exploit vulnerable patients. Her insights would need to be incorporated into the legislative framework. Evening found us at a fundraising dinner hosted by a patient rights organization. The ballroom buzzed with energy as advocates, medical professionals, and politicians mingled. My keynote speech focused on the economic impact of financial exploitation during health crises, numbers that made even skeptical listeners take notice. During the dinner, a senior congressman shared a personal story about his mother's experience with medical identity theft. His vulnerability in telling the story reminded me that these issues crossed all social and economic boundaries. Exploitation didn't discriminate by class or status. Back in my hotel room, I reviewed messages from the Advocacy Center. Grace had handled a difficult case brilliantly, preventing a property theft before it could be completed. Her growth from victim to powerful advocate mirrored my own journey, though each path was unique. A late-night email from Claire contained exciting news. She'd chosen her law school and already lined up a summer internship with a patient advocacy firm. Another survivor turning experience into expertise, pain into purpose. Her determination inspired me to push harder for comprehensive protections. Sleep proved elusive again as my mind raced with possibilities and concerns. The legislation was crucial, but laws alone wouldn't solve everything. We needed cultural change, systematic reform, ongoing vigilance. The predators would adapt. We needed to stay ahead of them. Morning brought a series of media interviews, each one an opportunity to build public support for the proposed protections. The stories we shared resonated deeply, generating social media buzz and congressional office calls. Public pressure could make the difference in close votes. Between interviews, Dr. Martinez updated me on a new initiative at the hospital. They were implementing advanced security protocols for patient financial information, creating an extra layer of protection during medical crises. The program would serve as a model for other facilities. Lunch with Caroline focused on expanding our legal team. The growing demand for advocacy services required more specialized attorneys, particularly those familiar with both healthcare and property law. Finding the right people who shared our mission would be crucial. An afternoon meeting with federal prosecutors revealed the expanding scope of medical identity theft networks. What had started as isolated crimes had evolved into sophisticated criminal enterprises. Our legislation would give law enforcement better tools to combat these organizations. Jessica called with updates from Boston. The Advocacy Center had received inquiries from hospitals in Europe and Asia interested in implementing similar protection programs. Our model was going global, adapting to different healthcare systems and legal frameworks. Evening brought a strategy session with grassroots organizers from across the country. Their stories of local advocacy efforts and small victories reminded me that real change happened person by person, community by community. National legislation would support their work, not replace it. A text from Emily arrived as the meeting ended. Patricia had been moved to hospice care. The news felt distant now, like reading about a stranger. My life had moved so far beyond that chapter, focused on creating rather than surviving, building rather than escaping. The hotel bar provided a quiet space for late-night reflection. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more testimonies, more steps toward comprehensive patient protection. The work was exhausting but essential, each small victory contributing to larger change. My phone buzzed with an urgent message from Maria. Another case had come in, this one involving a healthcare worker exploiting patient information. The predators were now coming from inside the system, making our work even more crucial. Each new scheme reinforced the need for stronger protections. Sleep finally came as midnight approached. My dreams filled with images of secure hospitals, protected patients, and advocates standing guard against exploitation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to create lasting change. The city lights twinkled outside my window, each one perhaps marking another story, waiting to be changed, another life waiting to be protected. In the quiet darkness, I felt the weight of our mission and the hope of our progress. Change was coming, step by step, law by law, life by life. Cherry blossoms dotted the sidewalks of Boston as spring settled into the city. The Advocacy Center buzzed with activity, our expanded team working tirelessly to implement the newly passed federal protections. Each ring of the phone, each email alert, each walk-in client represented another opportunity to put these hard-won safeguards into action. Maria burst into my office, waving a printout from our data analysis team. "We've got something," she announced, spreading the papers across my desk. "A pattern in hospital admissions data that matches our fraud indicators." The numbers told a disturbing story. Someone was using emergency room chaos to access patient financial information. Within hours, our response team assembled in the conference room. Caroline's legal expertise, Dr. Martinez's medical insight, and Jessica's administrative knowledge combined to create a formidable force against exploitation. The wall-mounted screens displayed patient admission patterns, property records, and financial transactions, all interconnected by threads of suspicious activity. A knock at the door interrupted our analysis. Thomas had flown in from New York, bringing crucial information about similar schemes he'd uncovered in Manhattan hospitals. His insider knowledge of predator tactics proved invaluable as we mapped out the exploitation network. Grace arrived with lunch for the team, her presence a reminder of why we fought so hard. She'd just finished training another group of peer supporters, expanding our network of survivors helping survivors. The sandwich boxes were barely opened when Senator Maxwell called, wanting updates on how the new legislation was working in practice. As afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, Emily texted an update about Patricia. The hospice nurses didn't expect her to last the week. The news landed softly, like the cherry blossoms outside, a natural ending to a complex chapter. My focus remained on the work at hand, protecting others from similar exploitation. Claire called from law school, excited about a case study she was developing based on our recent victories. Her professor wanted to use our advocacy model as an example of systemic change through grassroots action. The enthusiasm in her voice reminded me how far we'd come from those dark early days. A new client arrived just before closing, an elderly man named Frank, clutching medical bills and property documents. His hands trembled as he described how his nephew had pressured him to sign papers during cancer treatment. The familiar pattern sparked immediate action from our team. Evening found me reviewing security footage with hospital IT specialists. The emergency room cameras had captured suspicious behavior from a group of individuals posing as medical billing staff. Their sophisticated approach confirmed our fears about evolving predator tactics. Jessica stayed late, helping analyze admission records for potential vulnerabilities. Her promotion to network chief had given us unprecedented access to system-wide data, crucial for identifying exploitation patterns before they could harm patients. Dr. Martinez brought dinner from our favorite Italian place, the aroma of garlic and herbs filling the office as we worked. Between bites of pasta, we strategized about expanding our preventive measures to smaller regional hospitals. The predators were adapting, moving to less protected facilities. A call from James Foster interrupted our planning session. His latest investigation had uncovered links between medical identity theft rings and organized crime syndicates. The scope of exploitation was growing, becoming more sophisticated and dangerous. Night settled over Boston as we wrapped up the emergency response plan. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, implementing additional security protocols, training more staff, coordinating with law enforcement. The work never ended, but neither did our determination. Walking home through the quiet streets, I passed the site of my old house. The new owners had planted spring flowers, their colors bright against the twilight. The site sparked no pain now, just appreciation for how life moves forward, transforms, creates new beauty from old wounds. My brownstone welcomed me with familiar comfort. The wall of success stories had grown again. New photos, new letters, new victories. Each one represented not just a life protected, but a future preserved, a dignity restored, a strength discovered. A late-night email arrived from an international hospital network. They wanted to implement our protection protocols across their facilities in Europe and Asia. Our model was spreading globally, adapting to different healthcare systems while maintaining its core mission. Sleep proved elusive as my mind raced with possibilities and plans. The predators were evolving, but so were we. Each new scheme they developed pushed us to create stronger safeguards, better protections, more comprehensive support systems. Dawn broke over the city as I prepared for another day of advocacy. The cherry blossoms continued falling, nature's reminder that beauty can emerge from harsh seasons. Our work, like the spring renewal, brought hope and protection to those facing their darkest moments. My phone buzzed with messages from our expanding network. A center in Chicago had prevented a major fraud attempt. Our Los Angeles team had identified a new exploitation pattern. Seattle reported success with their peer support program. Each update confirmed the power of united action. Maria arrived early, bringing fresh data from overnight emergency room admissions. Her expertise in pattern recognition had become crucial to our preventive efforts. Together, we studied the numbers, looking for signs of potential exploitation. The morning team meeting focused on implementing new security measures. Caroline's legal team had drafted updated protocols, incorporating lessons learned from recent cases. Every adjustment, every improvement, represented another barrier between predators and vulnerable patients. Dr. Martinez shared encouraging news from the medical board. Our protection protocols were being added to standard hospital accreditation requirements. This systemic change would force facilities nationwide to implement basic safeguards against exploitation. Mid-morning brought a surprise visit from Robert Chen, now working with hospital security consultants. His insights into property fraud schemes helped us refine our prevention strategies. The reformed insider had become a valuable ally in our mission. Grace organized a support group session in the community room, creating space for survivors to share their stories and healing journeys. The sound of their voices, strong and supportive, filtered through the office walls like a chorus of resilience. Lunch seemed like a distant concept as we responded to an urgent alert from a partner hospital. Their security team had identified suspicious access attempts in the billing department. Our rapid response protocols kicked in immediately, preventing potential exploitation. Caroline coordinated with federal prosecutors, sharing evidence from our recent cases. The legal landscape had shifted dramatically since the new legislation passed, giving authorities better tools to combat medical exploitation schemes. Afternoon brought a video conference with international partners. Hospitals in London, Toronto, and Sydney had successfully adapted our protection model to their healthcare systems. Each implementation taught us new lessons, revealed new vulnerabilities to address. Jessica's network update revealed encouraging trends. Reported exploitation attempts had decreased significantly in facilities using our protocols. The data validated our approach while highlighting areas needing stronger protection. A text from Emily carried unexpected news. Daniel had started volunteering at a patient advocacy center in Chicago. His journey from complicit bystander to active protector suggested hope for broader social change. Evening settled over the city as our team reviewed the day's achievements and challenges. Each case prevented, each victim supported, each predator stopped, represented a small victory in our larger mission. The work was endless but essential. A call from Senator Maxwell confirmed upcoming congressional hearings on expanding patient protections. Our success had sparked interest in addressing other forms of medical exploitation. The momentum for change continued growing. Night brought quiet reflection in my brownstone study. The wall of success stories seemed to glow in the soft lamplight, each one a testament to the power of protection, advocacy, and support. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to create lasting change. My phone lit up with a message from Claire. She'd aced her healthcare law exam and secured a summer internship with a prominent patient rights firm. Another survivor turning experience into expertise, another voice joining the fight for protection. Sleep approached as cherry blossoms continued falling outside my window. Their gentle descent reminded me that transformation requires both strength and softness, protection and growth, endings and new beginnings. Our work embodied this delicate balance. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, new threats to address, more lives to protect. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of my home, I felt the full circle of my journey. From victim to protector, from wounded to healer, from alone to surrounded by warriors for change. The city lights twinkled beyond my windows, each one perhaps marking another story waiting to be protected, another life waiting to be preserved. In the peaceful night, I felt both the weight of our mission and the strength of our growing movement. Change was coming, step by step, case by case, life by life. Our network of protection grew stronger each day, our methods more refined, our reach more extensive. The predators would keep evolving, but so would we, always one step ahead, always ready to guard the vulnerable. The cherry blossoms would continue falling, marking nature's cycle of renewal and growth. Our work, like the spring itself, brought new life from difficult seasons, hope from hardship, strength from struggle. Tomorrow awaited with its challenges and opportunities, but tonight's quiet affirmed the rightness of our path. Summer heat shimmered over Boston as I stood at the podium, addressing the National Conference on Patient Protection. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons buzzed with energy. Advocates, medical professionals, and lawmakers gathered from across the globe. 5 years had passed since that fateful day in the hospital, and here I was, witnessing the culmination of our collective efforts. Emily's message arrived just as I finished my keynote speech. Patricia had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news settled softly, like the last piece of a puzzle finding its place. There was no joy, no sadness, just quiet acknowledgement that some circles complete themselves in their own time. Back at the Advocacy Center, celebration mixed with focused determination. The walls now held plaques and awards, but more importantly, they displayed hundreds of success stories. Maria led the morning briefing, her confidence radiating as she outlined our latest initiatives. The frightened nurse who'd once lost everything had transformed into a beacon of hope for others. Dr. Martinez arrived with groundbreaking news. The hospital network had received federal funding to implement our protection protocols nationwide. What started in one Boston hospital would soon safeguard patients across America. The scope of change felt both overwhelming and exactly right. Grace organized an impromptu gathering in the community room, bringing together current clients with program graduates. Their stories flowed freely, tales of survival, recovery, and triumph. Each voice added strength to our shared mission. Each experience contributed wisdom to our evolving approach. Caroline's legal team occupied the conference room, finalizing documents for an international cooperation agreement. Our model would soon protect patients in hospitals across Europe, Asia, and beyond. The predators had gone global, but so had our response. A familiar face appeared in my office doorway, Daniel, visiting from Chicago. Time and perspective had softened our interaction, replacing old pain with professional respect. His patient. Advocacy work there had grown significant, proving that transformation was possible for anyone willing to choose a better path. Jessica coordinated with hospital administrators worldwide, her expertise ensuring smooth implementation of our protection protocols. The system she'd helped build had become the gold standard for patient security, a model studied and replicated across continents. Afternoon sunlight streamed through my office windows as Claire presented her law school thesis, a comprehensive analysis of medical exploitation prevention. Her journey from victim to legal expert embodied everything we fought for. Next month, she'd join our legal team, bringing fresh perspective to our evolving challenges. Thomas called from New York with updates on their latest preventive measures. His network of reformed insiders had become invaluable, helping us stay ahead of emerging exploitation schemes. Each prevented crime represented countless lives protected, futures preserved. The cherry tree I'd planted in the center's courtyard bloomed unexpectedly, out of season. Sometimes beauty emerges at unexpected moments, much like strength often surfaces when we feel most vulnerable. The blossoms reminded me how far we'd come from those dark, early days. Senator Maxwell visited unexpectedly, bringing news of expanded federal protections. Our success had sparked a broader movement, addressing various forms of exploitation during medical crises. The ripples of change continued spreading, touching more lives each day. Evening found me in my brownstone study, reviewing international implementation reports. The wall of success stories had grown so large it now wrapped around corners, each photo and letter representing a life restored, a future reclaimed, a dignity preserved. A text from Emily shared that Patricia's funeral would be small, private. The woman who once wielded such power over my life would depart quietly, her legacy transformed by the positive changes her actions inadvertently sparked. Sometimes light emerges from the darkest shadows. The Advocacy Center's expansion plans lay spread across my desk. New facilities, additional services, enhanced protections. Each page represented hope for countless future clients, each proposal aimed at preventing exploitation before it could begin. Maria's evening update revealed another prevented fraud attempt, our security protocols catching suspicious activity early. The predators kept evolving, but so did we, our methods growing more sophisticated with each challenge. Prevention had become our strongest weapon. Grace's support group celebrated another milestone, their 100th successful intervention. The peer support network had grown beyond our wildest dreams, creating connections that strengthened everyone involved. Together, they formed an unbreakable chain of protection and hope. Night settled over Boston as I prepared for tomorrow's international conference call. Our global network never slept, time zones ensuring constant vigilance against exploitation. Somewhere, always, advocates stood ready to protect the vulnerable. A late message from Claire announced her first solo case victory, preventing a property theft before it could impact her hospitalized client. Her success represented everything we'd built towards, the next generation of advocates carrying our mission forward. My phone lit up with updates from partner centers nationwide. Chicago prevented an identity theft ring. Los Angeles identified a new exploitation pattern. Seattle expanded their support services. Each report confirmed the power of united action against predation. The city lights twinkled beyond my windows, each one perhaps marking another story, waiting for protection. Our work would never end, but neither would our determination to safeguard the vulnerable. Every victory, large or small, contributed to lasting change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh battles, more lives to protect. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of my home, I felt the full circle of my journey. From victim to survivor, to advocate to leader, each step had led to this moment of profound purpose. Words filtered through the melody in my head. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these. Just click and check them out.